Hello, my name is Dr. Garrett Ashbrenner with the University of Georgia Poultry Science Department. So today we're going to tackle the question, does poultry litter contain weed seeds? And to start us off, let's talk about what producers are thinking. We often see weeds sprout after we apply broiler litter, and we can come to the conclusion that that litter contains weed seeds. And we have some justification that ruminant manure, like cattle manure, often contains weed seeds. So why wouldn't poultry litter? Or even wild birds often have weed seeds that pass through their droppings. And so again, why wouldn't another bird, like a broiler, not do that as well? And so there are some theories about where these weed seeds are coming from. Some people think it's coming through the feed, and that weed seed laden feed passes through the bird. Weed seeds go into the manure. Also, we have the bedding material, maybe coming through, peanut hulls or straw. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about where these weed seeds might be coming from, and if it makes sense for them to still be viable by the time we apply them to our fields. So to start us off, let's talk about, where it might be coming through the feed, because we have to, grow the feed, make the feed before we really even can really consider producing birds. So in the United States, we grow corn and soybean as the predominant food for our livestock and poultry. So let's say we plant a crop of corn and soybean, and unfortunately, sometimes our agronomic crops end up with weeds. Unfortunately, it's common, so we might end up harvesting those weeds along with our grains, or run our combine through that field, and we will end up harvesting those weed seeds along with our grain. So what actually happens to those weed seeds that are harvested? Well, fortunately, most of our combines are equipped with a blower or a fan that removes the chaff away from the grain. And we've been able to see that about 95% of weed seeds are blown out the back end of our combines along with the chaff. We want relatively clean grain. We don't want chaff-laden grain, so our combines are equipped to take the chaff away. And we have to remember that weed seeds, are adapted to germinate quickly, grow very quickly, produce a lot of seed, and have that seed mostly distributed through the wind. And so the combine's fan or blower acts as a proxy to wind, and it blows those very light seeds out the back end of the combine with the chaff. So at least 5% of weed seeds are going to be, kept with the grain in the combine. So, but we can't always say that that's going to 100% end up going to the feed mill. But the seeds that end up going to the feed mill, we have to remember that we feed a processed feed to our commercial poultry. And so to start that off, after grain is harvested, it's going to be cleaned generally, because we don't want to feed trash grain. We want to feed, a very precise diet of good quality grain to our commercial poultry and livestock. So it's going to be cleaned, it's going to be stored, and it's eventually going to make its way to the feed mill. And so once we get to the feed mill, so ingredients are going to be coming in. Our grain's going to be ground. It's going to be mixed with other ingredients, and it's going to be conditioned and pelletized, probably be cooled. It might be crumbled, and then eventually maybe some, more heat-sensitive ingredients will be applied onto it. But where I'm going to draw our focus is the conditioning, the pelleting process. So looking at a conditioner and a pellet mill, the conditioner steams the mash grain in order to make a good quality pellet, and it's going to steam it at 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we see is that most seeds end up dying at 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of our weed seeds are very delicate. They're, like I said, they're meant to be spread through the wind. There are certain plants like sequoias and certain pines that need heat to scarify the seed in order for it to germinate, but most weeds aren't like that. They're very delicate, and they're meant to produce a lot of seed, and just hopefully a larger percentage of those seeds that is produced to get carried off the wind and then germinate. But weed seeds are typically light and very delicate. So what we see is that the conditioner and pellet mill in the feed mill normally destroy most of the weed seeds that end up coming into the system, that make it through the combine and make it through the cleaning process. But let's say we're feeding a mash diet that happens to not get conditioned and pelletized. I will like to draw our attention to the fact that in general, most of the feed we feed in the United States poultry is going to be pelletized. It might be crumbled afterward, but most of our U.S. commercial poultry feed is going to be pelletized. But for the sake of argument, let's just say we're feeding a mash diet that's not pelletized. So after it's done through the milling process, that feed is going to get sent to the farm. It's going to be stored in a bin somewhere. On that farm. It's eventually going to be taken into the house, run down the auger line into our feed pans, and then it will make it into one of our birds. But the question here is, do weed seeds actually survive the poultry digestive system, rather? And what we see through research that's been done over the course of almost 100 years now is that most weed seeds that pass through the bird's digestive system are rarely viable. That most weed seeds just can't handle the high acidity of the stomach acid of the bird. There are certain plants that do very well with that. Let's just say like blackberries. Often wild birds eat blackberries and drop viable blackberry seeds with their droppings. But like I said, most weed seeds are kind of delicate. They're meant to just produce a lot of seed, and hopefully those seeds will germinate. Most of the delicate weed seeds that we're going to be dealing with here are going to be destroyed by the digestive system of the bird. So if these weed seeds aren't coming from the bird, where are they coming from? And part of that second part of the theories we've talked about, it's coming through the bedding material. But in order to talk about bedding, let's talk about what actually makes up broiler litter. And so it'll be the bedding material. Maybe that's pine shavings, it's peanut hulls, it's rice hulls. It will have the poultry manure being produced by the bird. We might see some feed in there. There might be feathers and just other, byproducts of producing birds are going to be there. But most of what we would call, the predominant parts of poultry litter are the bedding material and the manure. So we've talked about the manure, and most likely any weed seeds that are getting passed through the bird that are going to be in the manure, if they actually make it that far, they're not going to be viable. So what about the bedding material? So let's talk about pine shavings. That's a very, very common broiler bedding material. So if we grind up a pine tree and then spread it in our chicken house, that doesn't necessarily make sense that that'd be contributing to weed seeds. Pine trees not making weed seeds. So most likely that's not going to be a source. But maybe more alternative bedding material like peanut hulls or straw. So peanut hulls, peanuts are, the hull of the peanut is in the ground. It's, in contact with the soil. So there might be a likelihood of, the weed seeds tagging along peanut hulls, or straw. Straw is made from the chaff that is left behind from the combine. So, and I said 95% of weed seeds are going to be shot out the back end of the combine with the chaff. So straw is that material. So there might be weed seeds that end up tagging along with our straw. But we'll talk about, are those weed seeds that are tagged along in these materials, are they going to be viable by the time we apply it out to our fields? And so in order to kind of discuss that, we need to remember in the United States, we typically use some type of built-up litter system. So we're going to apply our bedding material down, and we're going to reuse that material for multiple flocks. It may be just a year with a few flocks, or maybe multiple years with a lot more flocks. But in the United States, we typically use some type of built-up litter system to where it's going from, mostly carbon-based bedding material to more, high nitrogen, mostly manure based litter. And so, utilizing built-up litter, we have to work our litter, whether that be a windrower, a tiller, or a decaker. We're going to work that litter in order to make sure its lifespan as a bedding material is lengthened. And so that, like I said, it makes a very, high nitrogen, mostly manure-based material. And do we actually see viable seeds in built-up litter? What we see is that most weed seeds die due to exposure to ammonia, nutrient leachates, and heat, that kind of composting action that poultry litter creates. Those three factors have been shown to destroy seeds that are within the poultry litter. So, if that's the case, we're going to remove litter from the house. We might put it on a truck and go spread it out on our fields. So at this point of time, if we take it directly out of the house, there is very, probably unlikely that there are going to be viable weed seeds within this material. So what about a stack house? So let's say we don't spread the poultry litter right away. We take it out of the house and we put it in our stack house to apply at some point in time in the future. Again, there's very little chance that we're going to see viable seeds in this system. Maybe wild animals or wind are going to, drop some weed seeds here. But again, that ammonia, those nutrient leachates, and the heat that builds up from, very much compost-like system we've got going on in a stack house, it's going to kill the weed seeds. I've been very fortunate enough to go across the United States, and I've seen plants grow in some very interesting places. I've seen plants grow in cracks in the middle of parking lots that are so hot you'd think that nothing would be able to grow. I've seen plants grow in cracks in rock in the middle of a mountainside, but I've never seen a plant grow off the top of a stack house because of that ammonia, the nutrient leachates, and the heat that builds up destroys seeds that are within that system. So what's actually causing these weeds? It's not it is a fact that we often see weeds sprout after we apply poultry litter. So where are these weeds actually coming from? Where are these seeds actually coming from? And what we'll see, the real culprit is what we call the soil seed bank. And so the soil seed bank is a group, of dormant weed seeds, or just dormant seeds in general, within the soil. And what we can see, there's anywhere between 50 to 15,000 seeds per square foot of soil. That's a lot of seeds. And some of these seeds can last over 100 years. I find that fascinating. So some old quotes about this an old British gardener's quote is that 1 year's weeds is 7 years seeds. And so what that translates to, what that means is that if you let 1 year's weeds produce seed and distribute seed in your garden, you will probably see the seeds of that one germination, that one seed setting. You'll see them germinate the next 7 years. And so another one, an old forage agronomist one time told me that the weeds that we let set seed will often outlast us, our children, and maybe even our grandchildren. Just trying to hone in the fact that these seeds last a very long time within our soil. Just to give you an example here of an average soil seed bank profile of an Ohio soil that's averaged over 3 years, they were easily able to identify 12 different weed species within this soil. I just want to draw our attention to the fact that weeds are opportunists. So this is a great example. I love this picture. I took this on a commercial chicken farm. This is just some fill dirt that the producer had dropped next to their chicken house. And I see thistle, dock, and dog fennel very easily within this picture. Nobody planted those seeds there. There was no chicken litter that was applied to this pile of fill dirt. Those weed seeds germinated from the soil seed bank that was within that fill dirt. So a little bit of rain, a little bit of fresh air, a little bit of sunlight stimulated those weed seeds to germinate on that pile that were already within it, mind you. Just another example here of just how opportunistic weeds are is looking at the germination rate, comparing common pasture grasses versus weeds we might see in pasture. And what we see here in green, common pasture grasses that we like to grow, it can take over 20 days for those seeds to germinate after we apply. Well, when we look at weed seeds, what we can often see is that it may only take 5 days for weed seeds to actually germinate after hitting the soil. So again, remember that weeds are adapted to germinate fast, grow fast, set a lot of seed, and then spread those seeds through typically the wind. And so why would broiler litter trigger the germination of these seeds within the soil seed bank? And it comes down to the fact that broiler litter creates a conducive environment for germination. It provides nutrients, both macro and micro, and organic acids that produce that conducive environment. So, people sometimes, counter that statement with, well, what about commercial fertilizer? Why wouldn't that produce, weed seeds, to germinate? And what we see is that, nitrogen, just typical commercial fertilizer is going to be NP&K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Let's just say, keep it simple, let's say 10-10-10. It's 10 parts nitrogen, 10 parts phosphorus, 10 parts potassium. But broiler litter, or just manure in general, has nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It has other macronutrients and micronutrients, as well as those organic acids. It's that combination of lots of different types of nutrients plus organic acids produces that conducive environment for weeds to germinate. So to give a little bit of a demonstration, just a very quick project that I did utilizing sterile potting soil. So Group A had their pots filled with just sterile potting soil. Group B, we had sterile potting soil plus a brassica seed mix that we were trying to use as a proxy for weed seeds being dormant within our soil. And Group C had potting soil plus broiler litter. and group D had potting soil, broiler litter, and the brassica seed mix. And what we find here is that group A and C that we did not add seeds to, we didn't see any weed seeds. That the broiler litter that mixed with the potting soil, we saw no weed seeds germinating from this group. And I collected broiler litter samples from northeast Georgia. Didn't see any weeds germinate. We did see seeds germinate from the brassica mix and just the straight potting soil group B. But what I find interesting, group D, that we had the seed mix, the litter, and the potting soil, we actually see that this brassica mix ended up sprouting faster and grew better because of the extra nutrients that the broiler litter gave to that soil. So again, it's a very simple study and a very simple demonstration, but it kind of shows the point that broiler litter isn't producing massive amounts of seeds that are going to germinate in our soils. So looking at a more recent, research findings out of North Carolina State University, their group, they have a really good group of waste management experts out there, and they took 61 broiler litter samples and analyzed them for weed seeds and to see if they would germinate. They did actually find some weed seeds in their samples, but most were non-viable. Most would not germinate. Or if they did germinate, they had to take them out of the broiler litter and plant them in regular potting soil. But what they found is that the nutrient leachates in the raw manure typically destroyed the seeds. So, just a kind of a quick recap of what we've learned so far, that we do see that, weed germination after litter application, but this is coming from the existing soil seed bank. So, poultry litter is not introducing a significant amount of weed seeds to our soils, but it does create ideal conditions for weeds to germinate from seeds that are already within the soil seed bank. And so why exactly am I even talking about this? And it really comes down to the fact that I don't want people to fear poultry manure as a fertilizer because it's going to introduce seeds to our soils. I want to remind everybody that poultry manure has both macro and micronutrients. That if I apply a commercial fertilizer 10-10-10, I'm only providing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and that's great. And those are the three nutrients that are needed in the highest amount for plants. But remember, there's at a minimum of 18 essential plant nutrients that plants need to survive and produce. And what we can see here is that this graph of a typical nutrient profile of broiler litter is that we can provide most, if not all, the essential plant nutrients to our plants needed to produce and thrive through poultry manure application. Now, I can hear in the back of my head my soil science professors back in the day telling me that poultry manure and manure in general, does provide, fertilizer capability, but those nutrients aren't always in the correct ratios. And that's correct. We have to keep that in mind that, let's just say broiler litter is very high in phosphorus, a little bit lower in nitrogen. So our rate limiting application rate is going to be based off of our phosphorus. And that might mean that we aren't quite introducing enough nitrogen into our, in our cropping field. Now, we might have to apply, synthetic nitrogen along with that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we just have to keep that in mind, that the ratios aren't perfect like our, commercially formulated fertilizers. But if we base those application rates off of a soils test and apply at appropriate amounts, it's still an effective fertilizer. It also works as a slow release fertilizer. If I apply 10-10-10, as soon as those granules come in contact with moisture, those nutrients are in a plant available form. They're not in an organic form. They're in an inorganic form. That also means that they can, run off with water, or leach into the groundwater if we have excess water. It takes time for those nutrients in manure to break down from organic form that's bound to a carbon molecule to an inorganic form that plants can uptake, which then makes it a slow release fertilizer. And I'm okay with that. I like that because I want my nutrients in my fields to be available to the plants through the course of the entire growing season. I don't necessarily need them to be all available at the beginning of the growing season. I'm fine with that because we're going to have plants growing through the course of whatever growing season we're talking about, and I'm fine with that manure taking longer to act as a fertilizer. Not to say that there's not any fertilization capability as soon as we apply. There are nutrients available to the plants as soon as we apply. It's just they're not all immediately available like a commercial fertilizer. But the last thing that I like to talk about when I'm talking about using poultry manure as a fertilizer comes to soil improvement. Manure is a good soil amendment. It introduces organic material, organic matter to our soils. And so I want to draw our attention to, every percent organic matter that we increase in our soils increases water holding capacity per acre 18 to 25,000 gallons per acre. That both protects our farms from drought as well as flooding. If we're able to hold in more water in the soil, less of it's going to run off. So, just another thing to try to appreciate when we're talking about poultry manure. So again, poultry manure does act as a good fertilizer, and I don't want us to fear it because we think we're going to introduce a lot of seeds to our soils. So if we do utilize poultry manure as a fertilizer, my biggest suggestion is to have some type of weed management program. Maybe that means, we spray when we need to, or we clip our pastures if we need to, or we have a good pasture rotation system with our cattle to help manage the weeds. So that concludes my presentation today. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. If you have any suggestions for presentations, webinars, or newsletters, again, please reach out. So I appreciate it. I've been Dr. Garrett Ashbrenner with the University of Georgia Poultry Science Department, and we'll see you next time.